You wake up dead, which is impressive because you didn't expect to be waking up at all. There's no music, no light, no angels descending through mist or devils pulling you downward. Just the distinct sensation of movement, a dragging sensation to be precise, something rough scraping against your back, something colder than stone brushing against your cheek, and a smell. Dear God, the smell. It takes you a moment to realise that the smell is you. 9 months of decomposition doesn't do a body any favours. There's rot, of course, but also something more intimate, like wet cloth, sour wine, and boiled beef that's been left in the sun for far too long. Your limbs don't bend, your eyelids don't move. You try to shift your head and feel your neck flop sideways with all the grace of a sack of spoiled grain. You are not, by any meaningful standard, alive, and yet you are also very much not being left alone. The scraping continues. You're being dragged, not gently, not respectfully, not even in a cart which you might have considered, back when you had the power to make decisions. Number. It seems someone has taken you by the ankles and is hauling your desiccated remains across the floor like unwanted furniture. Stone beneath you, air above, and voices. Low, angry, Latin mostly, ecclesiastical Latin, the kind used for sermons and sentencing, and judging by the volume, you're heading somewhere public. Eventually, the dragging stops. There's a clatter, chains, no, ropes. You're being lifted, hoisted upright, in stages, like some macabre puppet in a very slow and grim puppet show. Your limbs sag, your chin droops, your robe, because yes, someone has dressed you in papal vestments again, is stiff with dried fluids and the indignity of the situation. A crowd murmurs. You're being watched, not in mourning either. This is not a funeral. This is a spectacle. Someone props your body into a chair, a throne technically, gilded, cracked, and probably stolen from a better era of papacy. The person adjusting you wears a sour expression, and gloves soaked in something strong enough to make his eyes water. He tightens the ropes at your shoulders, trying to stop your torso from folding in half. There's another rope tied behind your head, keeping it from lolling forward like a disgraced marionette. The effect is not dignified, it is not holy. It is, at best, unsettling. Then come the trumpets, off-key, over-eager, blaring like a drunken parade marching the wrong way through purgatory. You recognise the tune, processional fanfare, which would be touching if it weren't for the fact that you're the only one here who's supposed to be resting in peace. The crowd stands, cloaks shuffle, sandals scuff. You can hear coughing, muttering, someone spitting. Then a voice rings out, shrill, theatrical, heavy, with self-importance and venom. It's him, Pope Stephen VI, your successor, your tormentor, the man who hated you enough to bring you back from the dead, not to honour you, but to punish you. His voice echoes off the stone walls as he announces your name, your former titles and your crimes. Not recent ones, obviously. You've been dead since last fall. These are the sins of your life, missteps, ambitions, political choices made in a very bad time to be a pope. Choices he did not approve of. Choices he now intends to unmake. You are technically on trial. They call it a synodus horrenda, the dreadful synod, which is accurate if a bit understated. The full church is in attendance, or what passes for it, in 9th century Rome. Bishops, cardinals, monks with opinions. Some of them look confused, others deeply entertained. But most just look tired. The kind of tired that comes from surviving a century, that smells of mildew, misplaced power, and too many knives in too many backs. They're here to bear witness, to pass judgment, to watch a man already buried be unmade in public, like a sermon performed backwards. There is no advocate, not really. They've assigned you a deacon to speak on your behalf. A sad, sweating creature with the confidence of a whipped dog and the spine of a boiled eel. He stands beside your corpse and opens his mouth, then quickly closes it again, apparently unsure whether speaking for a cadaver is an act of loyalty or blasphemy. His presence is ceremonial. Everyone knows this trial is already decided. Stephen steps forward now, robes flaring like a self-righteous thundercloud, finger pointed squarely at your greying face. He accuses you of perjury, of corruption, of violating canon law by being both Pope and Bishop, a technicality that has somehow grown teeth in the dark corners of his rage. He accuses you of political betrayal, of backing the wrong kings, of switching allegiances when it suited you, which, to be fair, is not unusual for a pope, but Stephen has decided that you are the problem, and he has decided to make a point. The crowd is silent as he speaks, not because they believe him necessarily, but because this is entertainment. It's been a grim winter. The rivers are low, the politics high, and nothing livens up a dry theological dispute like dragging out a corpse and giving it a courtroom drama. Some of them are here for justice. Most are here for the morbid novelty. A few, it must be said, are here for revenge. As for you, you have no say in any of it. You can't object. You can't flee. You can't raise your hand and say this is all deeply inappropriate, not to mention theologically unhinged. You can only sit, slumped, robed in mildew and misremembered legacy, while your past is dissected in front of strangers who never liked you in the first place. The ropes are the only thing holding you together. This is your trial. You're not alive, you're not welcome, and you're not getting out of this with your dignity intact. But you are, in the eyes of the Church, still responsible. Before the rot set in, before the ropes, the throne, the smell, you were a man. Not just a man, actually, the man. Pope Formosus, Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, vicar of Christ on earth, wearer of ceremonial slippers, and inheritor of centuries of spiritual authority. At least, that's how it looked on parchment. In practice, you were the most powerful cleric in a city that had long since traded holiness for factional brawls and sewage runoff. Your crown was heavy, your enemies were many, and your tenure was less divinely inspired and more political hostage crisis with incense. You didn't always wear the white. Before Rome chewed you up and spat you back out investments, you were a bishop, a respected one too. Your career began with promise. You were a diplomat, the Church's go-to negotiator with Bulgaria and the Frankish kingdoms, fluent in Latin, clever with politics, and cautious enough to survive long enough to get promoted. But this was the 9th century, and ambition was like arsenic, tempting in small doses, lethal if you weren't careful. You tried to play the game. You tried to rise through the ranks like a good ecclesiastical servant. But the higher you went, the more the ceiling dripped blood. Rome in the 9th century was not the Rome of the Caesars. It was not the Rome of marble columns, disciplined legions, or soaring rhetoric. It was a Rome of rot, of cracked stones and broken aqueducts. A city that had once dictated the fate of nations now couldn't keep its streets clean or its bishops sober. The grandeur was gone. What remained was a sun-bleached skeleton of former glory, dressed in papal robes and pretending it hadn't just tripped over a goat. The smell hit first, no matter where you walked, and walking was your only option, because roads were little more than rocky mud paths with attitude. The air carried a pungent cocktail of human waste, animal droppings, stale wine, and rotting food. The Tiber ran thick and brown, more of a sluggish moat than a river. Sewage poured into it freely, and sometimes corpses, depending on the political climate. Rome had once bathed in fountains, now it soaked in its own runoff. And then there was the noise. Bells mostly, church bells, tower bells, funeral bells, wedding bells, bells for saints' days, bells because someone's pig got loose. They tolled morning, noon and night, sometimes out of sync, sometimes out of spite. Between the bells there were arguments, public, loud and often theological in nature, not the polite kind either. Men in robes would scream Latin curses at each other in the street, gesturing wildly with manuscripts and holy relics. Fistfights between monks weren't uncommon. Once, an argument over the date of Easter ended with 2 bishops in a ditch and 1 severely injured choir boy. The church, which should have been the city's guiding light, had instead become its favourite battleground. The papacy was a prize to be won, not a calling to be answered. Noble families treated it like a crown made of incense and tax exemptions. The most powerful clans, the Spoletos, the Tusculans, the Crescenti, all had their pet bishops, their favoured monks, their preferred popes in waiting. When one pope died or was murdered, which happened more often than it should have, they simply shoved another one into the throne, provided he was pliable enough to nod politely and stay out of the treasury. You had to be strategic to survive in this Rome, and if you wanted to lead, if you wanted to be pope, you had to be more than holy. You had to be ruthless. You had to know when to smile, when to kneel, and when to quietly poison someone's character in the right bishop's ear. You didn't get to be Formosus the Pope by accident. You got there because you knew how to play the game better than most, at least for a while. But even the best players lose eventually, especially when the board keeps changing, especially when your allies die or defect, especially when you're left holding a crown that everyone else suddenly wants to melt down and recast in their own name. That was Rome, a city that used to conquer the world, now cannibalizing itself one pontiff at a time. There's a strange optimism that comes with becoming pope. You think, finally I've made it, the top of the spiritual ladder, the vicar of Christ, the one person on earth with the keys to heaven, the biggest hat in Rome, and enough authority to stop wars with a sigh. But within days of your coronation, that hope begins to wither. Because being pope doesn't make you untouchable. It just makes you a bigger target. Enemies came fast. Some were predictable, rival bishops, noble families who didn't get their candidate on the throne, jealous cardinals nursing old wounds from forgotten councils. But others came from stranger places. You offended people without trying. You breathed wrong at the wrong banquet. You backed the wrong claimant to the imperial throne. You sent the wrong letter to the wrong court, or worse, failed to send one at all. In a city where every silence could be interpreted as a snub, you were constantly disappointing someone. The biggest mistake you made, the one that brought you more enemies than blessings, was involving yourself in imperial politics. You threw in with Arnulf of Carinthia, a Frankish noble with a crown-shaped hole in his life, and an army full of restless men. You believed Arnulf could stabilize Italy. He believed you could sanctify his ambitions. So, you made a deal. He marched on Rome. You crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. This did not sit well with the Spoleto family. The Spoletans were Rome's local power brokers, Italian nobles who believed they owned the city in everything but name. For years they had tried to control the papacy through intimidation, bribes and conveniently timed poisonings. They had their own imperial candidate in Lambert of Spoleto, a young man with more lineage than leadership skills. When you backed Arnulf instead, you declared war, not with swords but with sacraments. They remembered that. But it wasn't just the Spoletos. You also upset the Frankish bishops, who thought you should have crowned them emperor first. You offended Byzantines by refusing to play nice over jurisdictional boundaries in southern Italy. You irritated the bishops of Ravenna. And then there were the internal enemies, men in your own curia, nodding politely in public, while cursing your name in their journals. Then there were the theological purists, men who believed your elevation to the papacy was illegitimate from the beginning. You had already been the Bishop of Porto, and according to a murky interpretation of canon law, no bishop was supposed to transfer from one see to another. Ever. You'd technically broken that rule by becoming pope, they whispered. They wrote letters. They waited. Death, for most people, is the final curtain. The lights go out. The audience files away, and what's left is memory, embellished or neglected, depending on how you performed. For you, it was supposed to be a quiet ending. You died in the spring of 896, likely from a stroke or some other unremarkable affliction. No dramatic martyrdom, no public execution, just one last sigh in a palace full of murmurs. You died as Pope, which, given the political mess you'd been navigating, felt like a win. At the very least, it was an exit with dignity. They buried you properly. Robes, prayers, incense, the full ritual. Your tomb was respectable, if not particularly grand. There was no wailing procession, but there were bishops in attendance, muttered liturgies, solemn gestures. For a brief moment, your name was treated with reverence, and then, like most dead popes, you faded into the background noise of Rome's endless power shuffle. That should have been it. You'd played the game. You lost, eventually, but you earned your rest. But the 9th century had no concept of letting things lie. This was an era that believed in vengeance as a sacrament, grudges as doctrine. And Pope Stephen VI, the man who took over after the brief and mysterious papacy of Boniface VI, wasn't interested in letting your memory settle. He was interested in making sure it never stood again. Stephen was not a subtle man. His reign was built on the need to prove himself, to his patrons, to the Roman nobility, and perhaps most of all, to history. He saw your papacy as a festering wound in the church, and your corpse as the scalpel with which to excise it. You were everything he believed a pope should not be: political, opportunistic, and worst of all, successful despite the rules. And now that you were no longer in a position to argue, he could say anything he liked. And more importantly, he could show it. What happened next wasn't justice, it wasn't even theology. It was a performance, a grotesque blend of law, theatre, and very public desecration. And it began, as most spectacles do, with a rumour. The whispers started quietly. Something about exhumation. Something about a trial. Most people assumed it was metaphorical, that Stephen was planning to symbolically condemn your memory, perhaps issue a decree, tear down a plaque. But when soldiers were seen entering your tomb in the early hours of morning, carrying ropes and wearing expressions far too serious for grave maintenance, the city began to understand that this would be something else entirely. They dragged your body from its crypt. You had been dead for about 9 months, long enough to lose your shape, but not long enough to fully collapse. The air hit you like a curse. Your limbs, stiff with rot, had to be straightened manually. No small task, considering the humidity of Roman springtime and the quality of 9th century embalming techniques, which leaned heavily on prayer and hoping for the best. You were clothed in papal garments, or something resembling them, not out of respect but for theatrical effect. Your body was cleaned, or at least wiped down. The fingers were still intact. Your face, they said, was ghastly, more skull than skin, hollow-eyed and waxy. You were dressed for a trial you couldn't attend, presented to an audience you couldn't see. And then they propped you up on a throne, not a symbolic one, an actual throne hauled into the Lateran Basilica for the occasion. They tied your body upright with ropes. Your arms were positioned in something like a sitting posture. Your head sagged forward until they cinched it back into place with a strap. A corpse with the posture of a man, waiting to be scolded. The effect was horrifying, which was the point. That brings us back to the present, your trial. There are trials and then there are trials. This one is neither. It calls itself a synod, a council of learned churchmen convened to deliberate on matters of doctrine and discipline. What it actually is, however, is something much simpler. A public execution that skipped the living part. A kangaroo court, if the kangaroo was dead, dressed in papal robes, and being screamed at by a man foaming at the mouth and quoting canon law like it owes him money. Pope Stephen VI calls the court to order with the glee of a man who has been waiting far too long to air his grievances. His voice echoes through the basilica, thin but furious. He has summoned bishops, clergy, and officials to witness what he claims is a matter of dire ecclesiastical importance. He gestures grandly toward your seated corpse, roped to its throne, and announces that Pope Formosus, that is, you, will now stand trial for crimes against the Church. There is a pause. You do not respond, not out of guilt, but because your larynx has been out of service for several months. The charges, as laid out by Stephen, range from dubious to delusional. The central accusation is that you served as Pope while still holding your previous bishopric, that of Porto. Technically, canon law forbade bishops from abandoning one diocese for another, especially when that other diocese was Rome. It was a rule designed to keep churchmen from climbing the ladder like career politicians. Of course, plenty of others had violated it when it suited them, but you somehow were the one being called to account. Posthumously. Other charges follow. You're accused of perjury, of violating sacred oaths, of conspiring with foreign kings, of harbouring ambitions unfit for a holy man. Stephen repeats that word, ambition, like a curse, as if it's not the reason anyone ever becomes pope. He speaks as though the office is a burden carried by the humblest of saints, not a throne fought over by families with more swords than scruples. In his telling, you are a man consumed by lust for power, a traitor to the Church, and possibly, depending on his tone, the Antichrist in embroidered slippers. At no point are these claims examined with any real scrutiny. There are no witnesses called on your behalf, no examination of evidence, no documents reviewed beyond a few hastily prepared scrolls waved around for effect. The proceedings unfold like a deranged sermon aimed at a congregation of frightened bureaucrats and bored nobles. The outcome is already written. The only thing left is the performance. The deacon assigned to defend you does his best, which is to say, not much. He mumbles something about mercy, about tradition. He gestures weakly toward the corpse beside him, as if to say, hasn't he suffered enough? But no one listens. Stephen talks over him, shaming him for defending a heretic, a criminal, a vile pretender to the throne of Peter. The deacon retreats into silence, staring at the floor, like it might offer an escape route. It does not. The audience shifts uncomfortably. Some stare at you with wide eyes, others whisper to one another, trying to decide if what they're witnessing is history or madness. The stench in the room does not help. Despite the incense, despite the open windows, the air still carries the unmistakable aroma of decay. A few of the more sensitive clerics hold kerchiefs to their faces. Others do their best to ignore it. After all, this is a holy trial, just one that happens to involve a decomposing defendant, Stephen continues, sweat pooling under his collar as he grows more animated. He points at you like you might spring to life and admit your sins. He paces in front of the throne, reading from scrolls that no one has the courage to question. At one point, he pauses dramatically, staring into your lifeless eyes, as if daring you to speak. You do not. This is interpreted as guilt. Your presence is symbolic, of course. That's the point. Stephen could have simply condemned your memory. He could have issued a decree nullifying your acts, revoking your appointments, declaring your papacy void. But that wouldn't have satisfied him. He wanted your body present. He wanted Rome to see your judgment, to smell it, to feel it in their lungs. This wasn't about canon law. This was about humiliation, the pure, unfiltered rage of a man who could not rest until his enemies were stripped, broken, and reduced to a cautionary tale. And so the trial drags on, hour after hour, with no meaningful opposition. The bishops nod along, some because they agree, others because they're afraid. To dissent here is to side with a corpse. And in Rome, siding with the wrong corpse can get you a tomb of your own much sooner than expected. Eventually, the verdict is delivered. No deliberation necessary. You are found guilty on all counts. The crowd is silent for a moment, either stunned or simply trying to figure out what that means for a man who is already dead. Stephen does not hesitate. He orders your papacy annulled. Your acts as Pope are declared invalid. Your corpse is to be stripped of its vestments. Your fingers, the very ones that once performed sacraments, are to be cut off. The symbolism is grotesque and specific. You may have died with dignity, but Stephen is determined to tear it away piece by piece. The guards approach. One removes your ring, another tugs off the pallium from your chest. The cords that hold your arms to the throne are loosened only for your limbs to slump grotesquely to the sides. Someone retrieves a small knife, worn and rusted, and begins the grim task of removing the fingers you used for blessings. The crowd watches in horror. Even Stephen pauses as though momentarily realizing the depths of the farce. But the moment passes. By the end of the day, you are no longer Pope Formosus. You are a desecrated body in a chair, your titles revoked, your memory smeared, your fingers gone. You are a message carved in flesh, one final warning for anyone who dares to play politics in a city built on vendettas and buried saints. Justice has not been done. But something certainly has, to satisfy the illusion that this is a real trial and not a sanctified exorcism of your memory. You are assigned a defender, a deacon, possibly a monk. His official title is unclear, and so is his job description. What's certain is that he is not ready for this. He is young, too young to have known you personally, and he looks like he was chosen less for his knowledge of canon law and more for his inability to pose a threat to Pope Stephen's narrative. He stands beside your throne like a man who wandered into the wrong room and is too polite to leave. He doesn't introduce himself. He doesn't call witnesses. He doesn't even make eye contact with the corpse he's been assigned to defend. His hands tremble slightly as he clutches a scroll of parchment. Maybe notes, maybe just something to hold on to so they don't start shaking more visibly. The poor man is sweating through his robes, which cling to his back like a second skin. The basilica is stifling, a mix of incense, rotting silk, and the unmistakable aroma of your slow decomposition. If the room had any air left, it would be thick with discomfort. When finally prompted to speak, he clears his throat and tries. Truly, he tries. His voice is small and warbling, half swallowed by the echoing stone walls. He says something about mercy, about tradition, possibly about Christ's love, although it's hard to hear over the coughs, whispers, and faint snickering from the crowd. He references a passage of canon law, but mispronounces half the Latin and quickly loses the thread. It's hard to say whether the text was even relevant or if he's just reciting the only passage he remembers. Whatever argument he was attempting melts away before it can find footing. Stephen doesn't wait for him to finish. He interrupts with another tirade, accusing him of heresy by association. He demands to know how anyone could defend a man who broke the sacred rules of the church and then dared to die before answering for it. The deacon flinches. His lips move silently. He sits down without being told, staring at the floor, looking like he wants to disappear into it. No one claps. No one jeers. They don't need to. His failure is too quiet to be entertaining. The trial moves on, but not before Stephen pauses to emphasize how even the defense has nothing to say in your favor. He turns it into a rhetorical crescendo. If the man appointed to speak for the accused falls silent, then clearly the case speaks for itself. This logic is greeted with solemn nods by some and suppressed eye rolls by others. But no one dares say it aloud. The basilica, after all, is not a court of reason. It's a cathedral dressed up as a theatre. Meanwhile, you slouch in your throne, silent and still. You are, of course, incapable of offering any real defence. Your body leans slightly to one side. One arm droops lower than the other. Your jaw hangs slightly open, not in protest, but because the muscles holding it shut have long since given up. The effect is unfortunate. Less solemn witness to history and more puppet with a broken string. The crowd begins to murmur. Someone jokes that the corpse looks guilty. Another whispers that you blinked. A third claims to have seen you sneer at the Holy Father. Stephen is emboldened. He paces like a wolf in a cassock, tossing rhetorical questions to the court. He points to your silence as proof of guilt, conveniently ignoring that your silence is medically guaranteed. He mocks your deacon's cowardice, then claims that even your own defender couldn't find a reason to stand up for you. The trial has become theatre, and the script no longer calls for facts, just fear and noise. The poor deacon, whose name will never make it into any official document, stares into the middle distance, visibly shrinking by the minute. He holds his scroll like a shield, but it offers no protection. You can almost pity him. Almost. He was never equipped for this. No one is trained to debate theology against a corpse in a room full of power-hungry clerics and nervous nobles. He knows he's just a piece of stage dressing. Still, he shows up. That alone is more than most can say. He won't be mentioned in the records except perhaps as an unnamed assistant or unfortunate footnote. He did his duty, or something that looked vaguely like it, and now he will slink back to whatever monastery drafted him for this indignity, hoping never to be summoned again. His presence was a box to check, a procedural nod to fairness in a process that was never interested in justice. And you, the accused, sit tied to a throne in a church filled with sweat, incense, and quiet horror, waiting for the final verdict to finish what your death failed to. You are not defended. You are not heard. You are simply present, and that's enough. Because in this court, being present is the only crime that still matters. If there's one thing you can count on in a politically charged trial, especially one involving a corpse, it's witnesses. Lots of them. Some angry, some opportunistic, some who probably just wanted an excuse to wear their good robes. Pope Stephen VI calls them forward one by one, each ostensibly there to give testimony against you. What they actually deliver is something closer to a medieval talent show, where the talents include creative slander, theological improvisation, and bearing a grudge on command. The stage smells like embalming fluid and regret. The first few witnesses are expected. They are the dignified kind, or at least the type that wears dignity like a mask. Bishops you demoted, nobles whose pet clerics you refused to promote, archdeacons who once sent you letters and never received replies. They step up with stiff backs and narrowed eyes, holding prepared statements that may or may not have been written by Stephen's scribes. They accuse you of everything from oath-breaking to nepotism to unauthorized reallocation of sacred property, which is a long-winded way of saying you gave land to people they didn't like. One bishop claims you took territory meant for an orphanage and handed it over to a band of foreign mercenaries. It sounds damning, until you remember that foreign mercenaries in Rome usually meant anyone from a village more than 10 miles away who looked vaguely threatening. Another swears you offered bribes to secure your election. He does not explain how you managed to bribe half the College of Cardinals, while also being under house arrest at the time. No one asks. The logic doesn't matter. The performance does. After the respectable slanders are finished, the trial begins to slide downhill. The next round of witnesses don't read from scrolls. They just talk. A pale monk with sunken eyes steps forward, twitching slightly, and announces that you appeared to him in a dream and ordered him to renounce all worldly possessions. He claims he obeyed, gave away everything, and now his goats are barren. The implication is clear. You cursed his livestock from beyond the grave, the audience murmurs. Stephen nods solemnly. No one asks what happened to the possessions he supposedly gave up. possibly because they're now decorating Stephen's private chapel. Next comes a farmer, wringing his cap in his hands, trembling with what might be religious fervour or stage fright. He insists that his crops failed the year you were crowned pope. He doesn't remember exactly which year that was, but he's sure it's your fault. He describes a hailstorm that struck shortly after one of your letters was read aloud in his village, which to him is undeniable proof that you wielded unholy power over the weather. The idea that you controlled climate through correspondence somehow makes it into the official record. Then there's the man who claims your corpse blinked at him during the trial. This brings the proceedings to a halt. The room goes silent. A few people lean in. Someone stifles a laugh. Stephen, predictably, does not laugh. He bangs a ceremonial staff against the stone and declares that blasphemous mockery will not be tolerated. He orders the scribe to record the statement for further theological review. It remains unclear whether the blinking is interpreted as a sign of demonic unrest or posthumous sarcasm. And then, of course, comes the woman in the not-quite-nun's habit. She staggers toward the front of the basilica, sobbing loudly. Between gasps, she insists that during a Palm Sunday procession several years ago, you looked at her the wrong way. Ever since, she claims, she's been unable to sleep without visions of your cold, judging eyes. She doesn't clarify what these visions entail. She is eventually escorted away after attempting to lay hands on your foot, which, at that exact moment, falls off the throne and lands on the floor with a soft, deeply unceremonious thud. The crowd flinches, a few gasp, one person claps. They are also escorted out. At this point, the witnesses no longer resemble accusers. They're participants in a communal unburdening. Everyone has something to say. A merchant claims that after your papacy began, his wine soured in the cask. A boy insists that you once smiled at him in a dream. Then he broke his arm the next day, which clearly proves you cursed his balance. A soldier testifies that he heard your name whispered during a lightning storm. Someone else swears the moon looked strange the night you died. You, of course, say nothing. You sit where they've strapped you, slumped slightly leftward now, your body beginning to tilt like a badly propped marionette. Your jaw hangs open, your limbs increasingly limp. The ropes holding your arms are starting to sag. Your head bobs gently. Whether this is due to decay, gravity, or divine judgment is now a matter of heated speculation among the more theatrical observers. Some believe it's a sign you're trying to nod in repentance. Others insist it's evidence of possession. At least one man starts muttering an exorcism under his breath. The basilica, once a space for sacred deliberation, now feels more like an open mic night for Rome's emotionally unstable. The line between theology and hallucination disappeared somewhere between the barren goats and the haunted wine barrels. The crowd is less interested in justice and more in spectacle. The trial is no longer about proving wrongdoing. It's about venting, about ritual, about allowing everyone with a grudge, fear, or hallucination to air it out in front of a corpse who can't argue back. No one speaks in your defense. That part is over. Or maybe it was never really part of the plan. The deacon assigned to defend you is long silent, possibly praying, possibly reconsidering his career path. Even your few remaining allies know that standing up for a corpse on trial is not a winning political move. So you're left alone, not just physically, but narratively. The story being told is one in which you're not allowed a voice, just a body, just a symbol. Not because no one believes in you, but because in a room where ghosts are accused of blinking, livestock is cursed through dreams, and theological guilt is measured by rainfall. Belief no longer matters. Reality no longer matters. The only thing that does is volume, and how much of it can be directed at a man too dead to interrupt. The verdict, of course, is guilty. You didn't expect anything else. No one in the room did. This has never been about innocence or guilt, not in any meaningful sense. The Cadaver Synod has been a ritual from the start, an elaborate exorcism disguised as jurisprudence, a ceremony in which a city tries to bury its guilt by punishing a corpse. The only question left is how far Stephen VI will take it. The answer, as always, is too far. Stephen announces your guilt with the self-satisfied flair of a man who has rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. He stands at the centre of the basilica, his voice shrill with victory and sweat pooling under his collar. He delivers the sentence like a sermon, a string of canonical denunciations laced with thinly veiled rage. Every action you took as Pope, every appointment, every decree, every blessing is declared invalid, erased, as though the ink you once laid down has been peeled from history like parchment scraped clean. It's all symbolic, of course, but symbols carry weight here, especially when draped in incense and shouted from the altar. You are no longer a pope, not even a dead one. You are a defrocked fraud, a theological error in need of correction. Stephen wants to make sure you're remembered, not as a spiritual leader, but as a cautionary tale. And so, the ritual continues. The same attendants who earlier dressed you in papal robes now return to undress you, this time with none of the solemnity and even less care. They tug at the vestments, snapping seams and popping fastenings with jerks and pulls. Your garments stick where the rot has glued cloth to flesh. Your arm is yanked hard enough to make it flop sideways, and the crowd collectively winces. When the robe snags on your shoulder, it pulls off a thin patch of skin, revealing the dull gleam of bone beneath. One of your sandals comes off with a wet slap and skids across the floor. Someone in the crowd snickers, just once. Then silence returns. The gloves come next, peeled from your hands like the final layers of dignity. Your fingers, once the instruments of holy rites, now twisted and sunken, are exposed to the flickering torchlight. They are pale and brittle, curled inward, as if still holding something. Once those fingers anointed bishops. Once they held the Eucharist. Now they are just relics of a man, no longer permitted to have mattered. A deacon steps forward, with something resembling a ceremonial knife. It is dull, not sharpened for this task, and its hilt is wrapped in cloth to keep it from slipping. He hesitates. You are not resisting, obviously, but still he pauses, as if what he's about to do crosses some unseen line. Then he moves, steady and deliberate, and begins to saw through the two fingers of your right hand, the pointer and middle, the sacred digits used in blessing. The crowd doesn't breathe. It is not a clean cut. The blade catches, drags, needs effort. The flesh offers little resistance, but the bone does. The sound is quiet but nauseating, like dry wood being whittled. Eventually, the fingers separate. A cloth has been placed on your lap to catch the pieces, but one slides off, bounces, and lands on the cold stone floor. No one picks it up. Stephen for once does not gloat. He turns away briefly, perhaps startled by the effectiveness of his own cruelty, or maybe he's savouring it. The lines blur quickly in a place like this. This is not justice. It never was. It is humiliation, masquerading as righteousness, mutilation wrapped in a cassock. The cutting of your fingers serves no legal function. It is meant to unmake you, not just physically, but sacramentally. If your hands no longer bear the symbols of blessing, then perhaps the blessings themselves never counted. It is theology by theatre, and it's working. The crowd looks away. A few pale. Even the torchlight seems colder now. But Stephen isn't finished. He orders your body removed from the throne. The throne, after all, was for popes. You, he insists, never were one. And so you're hauled off, no longer dressed, no longer propped upright, no longer even a spectacle, just a corpse again. You are taken from the basilica, past the jeering and the silent, past the incense still hanging like a fog, and out into the Roman night. There is no hearse, no bier, no procession. You are loaded onto a wooden cart and wheeled away like refuse. Your destination is not a tomb, but a pauper's grave, a patch of land used for those who could not afford the dignity of stone. The pit is shallow, the dirt loose. They do not lower you so much as tip you in. Your body lands in a heap, robes askew, limbs at unnatural angles. Someone shovels dirt over you quickly. No one recites a prayer. No one lights a candle. The only marking is a small wooden stake, uncarved and already rotting. This is meant to be the end. A final erasure, an undoing, but it doesn't take, because even buried, you're still inconvenient. Rome has a way of refusing closure, of chewing on problems long after they should be digestible. The people who hated you still feel uneasy. The ones who cheered your trial start to look over their shoulders. The bishops who sat in silence begin to wonder whether they just witnessed justice or participated in a farce. And your supporters, small in number but still present, begin whispering. Something isn't sitting right. The ground, it seems, is not done shifting. The grave, shallow as it is, does not hold you long. Before the year is out, you will be exhumed again, not for sanctification, but for disposal. The earth is not final. Not in this Rome, not for you, and not for the legacy that refuses to stay buried. You might think that once a trial is over, especially one involving a corpse, the matter would be put to rest. You'd think the symbolic flaying of a dead pope in front of a crowd, complete with finger removal and ceremonial robe stripping, would be sufficient for even the pettiest of grievances. But this is 9th century Rome, where closure is an illusion, revenge is a team sport, and dignity is optional. Apparently, your burial, if the term even applies to being tossed into a shallow hole with barely enough dirt to discourage stray dogs, didn't feel final enough. The message wasn't clear enough. The act hadn't landed. It lacked flair, or drama, or whatever morbid satisfaction Pope Stephen VI and his circle were still craving. So someone, maybe Stephen himself, maybe a bishop, maybe a noble with a flair for dark comedy, made the decision. Dig him up again. Not for redemption, not for reconsideration, just for one last emphatic insult. The reasons aren't entirely clear. They never are in this city. Some sources claim Stephen had second thoughts, not about your guilt, but about whether a quiet burial did justice to his vendetta. Others say the people demanded it, though the people in 9th century Rome typically meant a few powerful families, and the hired muscle that shouted on their behalf. One theory even claims the grave rejected you, that the earth itself spat you out. But the likeliest answer is also the simplest. Someone still wanted to make a scene. And so the scene was made. Your grave, only if it could be called that, was reopened. No ceremony, no procession. Just dirt scraped away by a handful of attendants, grumbling and muttering under their breath. Your body, now far worse for wear than when it was first buried, was hauled out again. You weren't intact. Time had taken a toll. So had gravity. So had the indignities of your previous trial. Your robes were ragged. Your limbs were stiff. One of your eyes, according to rumour, had sunk halfway into your skull. If this was what victory looked like for Stephen, it was a hollow one. You were not taken to a new tomb. There was no suggestion of reburial. You were dragged, not carried, through back alleys and across uneven streets toward the river. The Tiber, once the lifeblood of an empire, now reeked of sewage, fish guts and unanswered prayers. It moved slowly, brown and bloated, a natural sewer with ambitions of being a holy boundary. And now it would serve as your final destination. There was no liturgy, no psalm, no chant, just the scrape of sandals, the wheeze of effort, and the squelch of damp robes dragging across cobblestone. A few onlookers followed, watching from doorways, whispering, perhaps crossing themselves, not out of reverence, but in case whatever curse was attached to your legacy happened to be contagious. At the riverbank, there was no hesitation. You were lifted, roughly, inelegantly, like a sack of wheat, and hurled into the water with all the care afforded to spoiled meat. You hit the surface with a slap, half splash, half thud. For a moment, you disappeared. Then, predictably, you floated back up, bloated, pale, still papal, if only an outline. And down you went, downstream past the broken aqueducts and collapsing churches, past marketplaces where your name had once commanded fear and now prompted uneasy laughter, past the homes of those who had once served you and now watched from windows, pretending they didn't. You drifted slowly, gently, a swollen symbol of ecclesiastical spite. The river did what the court could not. It carried you away. The Tiber, of course, was not kind. The current rolled you sideways, turned you gently over. Your limbs trailed behind like kelp, your robes tangled on submerged roots, bits of fabric snagged on jagged stones. A loose piece of something, a finger, a toe, something else no one wanted to identify, floated nearby. Fish approached, circled, reconsidered. Even scavengers have standards. Children spotted you from the banks and pointed. One threw a stone, it missed. Another shouted that the corpse was blinking again. Adults told them to hush. An old woman crossed herself 3 times and whispered something about judgment. But no one tried to pull you out. That wasn't the point. You weren't meant to be rescued. You were meant to be erased. The crowd, if it could still be called that, eventually dispersed. Some walked home in silence. Others made jokes to cut the tension. A few muttered prayers they hadn't said in years. Stephen's men didn't linger. Their job was done. You were no longer just excommunicated. You were discarded, waterlogged, out of sight, out of mind. Or so they hoped. And as you floated, slowly, inexorably, you became something more than a corpse. You became a symbol, not of sin or sanctity, but of what happens when vengeance outruns reason. You were no longer Formosus the Pope, or even Formosus the accused. You were flotsam, detritus, a cautionary tale made soggy. There is perhaps a strange peace in that, a kind of freedom in becoming useless to your enemies. They had tried everything: excommunication, mutilation, trial, burial. Now they'd resorted to the river. You had passed from relevance into raw embarrassment. And while you drifted face up through Rome's filth, the people who had condemned you began to feel the stirrings of discomfort. Because throwing a pope into the river, even a dead one, doesn't go unnoticed. Not by the faithful, not by the bishops, and not by history. Eventually, someone would fish you out, not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Whether out of pity, guilt, or political necessity, someone would retrieve what was left of you and try to fix what had been so publicly broken. Your trial had been loud, your sentencing grotesque, but your drowning, in its silence, unsettled even those who thought they'd moved on. You, of course, remained silent, but the current had a voice, and the city, however much it tried, could not quite drown out what it had done. For a brief triumphant moment, Pope Stephen VI believed he had won. The corpse had been tried, the robes torn off, the fingers sliced clean, the body buried, then dug up again, then flung into the Tiber like a rotting love letter to ecclesiastical vengeance. The crowd had witnessed it all. The bishops had nodded, or at least hadn't objected. The scribes had taken their notes. The incense had burned. The verdict had been declared with the kind of fire and fury usually reserved for plagues and heresies. In Stephen's mind, it was finished. Formosus was no longer a pope. He was no longer a threat. He was a bloated non-entity bobbing downriver. Victory, in all its sour glory, had been achieved. Unfortunately for Stephen, Rome didn't agree. The immediate reaction to the Cadaver Synod was silence. Not the good kind, but the stunned, breath-held kind. People staggered out of the basilica blinking, not sure what they'd just seen. Even in a city where murders happened at monasteries and bishops regularly poisoned each other with sacramental wine, this had been something new, something worse. It was surreal. It was grotesque. It was excessive. And once the incense faded and people had time to think, the discomfort fermented into something far more dangerous: anger. At first it was confusion, quiet questions in alleyways, nervous jokes at taverns, priests muttering that perhaps, just perhaps, tying a dead pope to a chair and yelling at him for an hour was not, strictly speaking, the work of the Holy Spirit. But then came the doubts, louder now. Had they just witnessed a heresy? Was desecrating a pope's corpse really sanctioned? Even in a city jaded by centuries of corruption, this felt like a line had been crossed. A pope, a real pope, no matter how flawed, had been desecrated in full view of the faithful. And the people finally began to speak. The riots didn't come all at once. They built slowly, in waves of shouting and scorn. Markets turned into shouting matches. Crowds formed outside churches, chanting Formosus' name like a saint. Let the dead rest, someone carved into a stone wall with a chisel. Another group smashed the front doors of a chapel known to support Stephen. A statue of a saint was paraded through the streets, not in reverence, but in protest, draped in scraps of fabric meant to mock papal robes. People began carrying bits of rope to symbolize the ties that had held your corpse upright. One monk was caught burning a copy of the trial transcript in the street, and behind the noise, behind the crowds and slogans, was fear. Because if Stephen could do this to Formosus, what could he do to the rest of them? What if he decided another bishop's burial was invalid? What if he put more dead men on trial? What if sainthood itself was subject to retroactive edits based on papal grudges? Even those who'd hated Formosus in life began to feel uneasy. The spectacle had broken something. Not just custom, but confidence. The system was no longer just corrupt. It was unpredictable. And in a city built on ritual and reputation, unpredictability was poison. Stephen tried to control the backlash. He issued statements through trembling scribes. He gave sermons filled with fire and fury, condemning the enemies of the church and insisting that the synod had been righteous, necessary, holy. He blamed Formosus' supporters for the unrest. He blamed the Franks. He blamed heretics, apostates, foreign spies, anyone really. But it didn't matter. The crowds weren't listening anymore. The bishops began whispering behind closed doors. Some who had nodded along during the trial now claimed they had expressed concern in private. Others stopped showing up to Stephen's assemblies altogether. The silence from the clergy was more telling than any public speech. Rome was shifting. The high-ranking officials who once backed Stephen began removing themselves from his circle. Letters went unanswered. Invitations were declined. One archdeacon took an extended retreat and never returned. A few bold voices even called the Cadaver Synod a mistake. Quietly, yes, but clearly. The palace began to feel smaller, colder, less secure. And Stephen? Stephen started to unravel. His sermons, once theatrical, grew paranoid. He spoke of shadowy plots and spiritual sabotage. He ranted about curses and betrayal. He ordered arrests. He accused rival factions of working with demons, or at the very least with Lombards. He doubled the palace guard. He demanded loyalty oaths from his clergy, but the more he clutched at control, the more it slipped away. By summer the tide had turned completely. The people no longer feared him. The bishops no longer respected him. And the nobility, that shifting snake-like web of power brokers and family alliances, had seen enough. Stephen wasn't useful anymore. He was erratic, unstable, and most damning of all, embarrassing. A faction of nobles backed quietly by the same church officials who had once stood beside him made their move. It was not dramatic. There was no uprising, no battle, just a quiet knock at the palace door one evening, and the next morning, Stephen was gone. Arrested, imprisoned, stripped of power without fanfare or resistance. He didn't last long in his cell. In the same city where he'd declared you unholy, unworthy, and unfit to rest, Stephen VI was strangled to death. No trial, no witnesses, no robes, no incense, just a choking hand in the dark and silence. He died alone, without the rituals he once weaponized. His end was as unceremonious as your river burial, but far less memorable. The Cadaver Synod, intended to erase your legacy, had done the opposite. It had made you a martyr, not of doctrine, but of dignity. You became the symbol of a church so broken it couldn't even let the dead die in peace. And Stephen, he became a warning. You were remembered, not as a saint, not even as a particularly good pope, but as a victim of something worse than heresy, ego. And Rome remembered both of you, not for your holiness, but for what happens when power becomes theatre and the curtain refuses to close. The thing about political spectacles is that they tend to unravel faster than they come together. Carefully orchestrated moments of control have a way of slipping loose at the seams once the lights go down and the audience disperses. And for Pope Stephen VI, what was meant to be his greatest performance, a righteous public condemnation, a bold assertion of papal authority, a corpse trial for the ages, ended up being the thing that broke him. At first, Stephen thought he'd pulled it off. He had declared your every papal act null and void. He had stripped you of your vestments, your titles, your fingers. He had buried you, dug you up, and tossed you into the Tiber with all the drama of a man expecting history to applaud. The church had been cleansed. His enemies, or at least their remains, had been paraded, punished, and discarded. Surely, this was the kind of papal legacy that endured. And in a way it was, but not in the way he'd hoped. The Cadaver Synod had stunned the city into temporary submission. People had watched in breath-held disbelief. The bishops had offered murmured consent. But as days passed, what began as shock began to rot. Rome was many things, but emotionally stable was not one of them. And even in a city accustomed to scheming clergy and bloody backdoor deals, this whole affair struck a nerve. People began talking. The crowd that once chanted Stephen's name began to spit it. The bishops who had nodded politely began to avoid eye contact. And the nobles? They were already plotting an exit strategy before your foot hit the river. The spectacle had overreached. It wasn't seen as courageous or necessary. It was seen as grotesque, embarrassing. A pope had stood in God's house and screamed at a corpse. And the moment that realization set in, the political support that had propped Stephen up for months began to disappear like incense in the rafters. Bishops who had once lent their authority to Stephen's decisions began privately distancing themselves from the whole ordeal. They whispered doubts, they drafted careful letters, they revisited canon law with a suspiciously retroactive lens. There were concerns from the beginning, some claimed. We were misled. Others simply developed spiritual laryngitis and stopped speaking of the synod altogether. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened than to justify what everyone had seen. The nobles were even less sentimental. To them, Stephen had become a liability, unpredictable, volatile, and worst of all, unpopular. Power in Rome wasn't just about strength. It was about favour, illusion, momentum, and Stephen had lost all three. His sermons became rants, his commands ignored. He saw enemies in every corner and shadows in every ally's smile. He lashed out at former supporters. He denounced bishops from the pulpit. He doubled the palace guard and sent spies into monasteries. But paranoia isn't power. It's just the noise power makes as it dies. Then, quietly, inevitably, the decision was made. A faction of clergy and nobles met behind closed doors. No grand councils, no public declarations. Just a quiet agreement. It was time. Stephen had to go. One night, he was arrested in the papal palace. Not with a mob, but with a whisper. He was taken from his chambers and led down stone corridors, with no torches lit. There was no protest, no resistance. He knew what was happening. The silence was answer enough. They locked him in a cell, No robes, no mitre, no throne. Just rough walls, a straw mat, and a door that didn't open again. What happened next is fuzzy. The records grow vague, contradictory. Some say he went mad. Some say he begged. Some say he starved. But all agree on how it ended. Within a few weeks, possibly days, Stephen VI was found dead, strangled, likely with his own bedding, though some claimed it was a garrote brought in by a masked intruder. Whatever the method, the message was clear. There was no trial, no ceremony, no final blessing. No one carried him to the Tiber, but no one built him a tomb either. He simply vanished into the walls of the prison, where so many of Rome's problems were quietly resolved. The man who had screamed about justice over a corpse was now just another piece of papal wreckage buried under layers of political sediment. His supporters did not protest. His former allies issued no denunciations. In fact, the silence was deafening. The same bishops who had watched you be defrocked and dismembered now whispered that the Cadaver Synod had been misguided. Some claimed they hadn't really supported it. Others said they had only gone along with it to avoid scandal, as if watching a corpse put on trial wasn't the scandal in question. The Church's collective memory began to shift, reshape, redact. Your trial became an unfortunate episode, a lapse in judgment, a moment of madness, not shared, but solely Stephen's. You, meanwhile, made one last quiet reappearance. Your body, having washed downriver in disgrace, was eventually recovered, not by Rome, but by monks from some remote abbey who either pitied you or saw an opportunity to get on the right side of history. You were reburied, quietly, without ropes, without accusations, without spectacle. Just a grave, maybe a prayer. Nothing more. The location is still debated. Some say it was St. Peter's. Others say it was somewhere far less grand. But the point is, you were finally left alone. Not because you were vindicated, not because you were forgiven, but because people were tired. You had become too radioactive to dig up again. Too symbolic, too cursed. And so Stephen, who had wanted to burn your memory to the ground, ended up buried beneath the ashes of his own ambition. His name became a punchline. His reign, a warning. He had tried to cleanse the church with theatre and ended up excommunicated by time itself. You were the corpse, but he was the real casualty. Because in Rome, power is a flame, and Stephen VI mistook a torch for a throne, and it burned him. You might have thought the story would end with Stephen VI's death, and your quiet reburial. A neat conclusion. A dead pope wronged. A mad pope punished. The church humbled but wiser, returning to its usual business of political backstabbing, relic smuggling, and accidentally canonising questionable monks. But no, your corpse was allowed to rest, more or less. Your legacy? Absolutely not. Because in the 9th century church, a reputation didn't die when you did. It lingered, it festered, it got picked apart like a leftover feast at a bishop's banquet. And yours, already a complicated thing in life, became an absolute theological tug-of-war in death. No one could agree on what to do with you. One pope's heretic was another pope's martyr. One council's mistake was another's masterstroke. You became, unintentionally, the most controversial corpse since Christ. After Stephen VI's strangling, poetic if abrupt, the papal office found itself in damage control mode. Your river baptism had made waves, and now someone had to clean up the spiritual debris. Pope Theodore II stepped up. He reigned for 20 days, barely long enough to find his seat at the table. But in that brief flicker of authority, he acted, fast, decisively, with the urgency of a man who knew the church needed to save face before the mob finished the job Stephen had started. Theodore declared the Cadaver Synod null and void. You, he said, were a pope again. Your decrees were valid. Your sacraments, especially the ones involving now prominent bishops, were legitimate. Your dismembered reputation was stitched back together in the eyes of canon law. even if your body remained somewhere under layers of silt and scandal. A reburial was arranged, quiet, dignified, and this time the grave came with the unspoken promise that no one would go digging again. But 20 days is hardly enough time to restore order to a church that had just tried a corpse, so Pope John IX followed suit. He took Theodore's ruling and reinforced it with the papal equivalent of duct tape and divine muscle. He convened a synod, an actual, living one, and passed a rule that no one, ever again, could put a dead man on trial. It seemed so obvious that it almost felt redundant, but apparently history needed the reminder. Your rehabilitation was complete, officially, legally, spiritually, for the moment. And for a moment, the church exhaled. Maybe now people would stop asking questions. Maybe the Tiber would forget. Maybe future generations would skim past the episode as a footnote, not a full-blown embarrassment. You were a pope again. Not loved maybe, but tolerated. And in Rome that was as close to peace as anyone ever got. But peace in Rome is a myth, a nice one, short-lived. Because along came Pope Sergius III, a man with old grudges, sharp instincts, and absolutely no interest in sweeping anything under the ecclesiastical rug. Sergius had been part of Stephen's original faction. He hadn't just supported the Cadaver Synod, he had benefited from it, and he wasn't about to let your rehabilitation rewrite history in a way that made his side look petty, paranoid, and pathologically theatrical. So Sergius reversed course, again. The Cadaver Synod? Entirely valid, he said. Stephen VI, wrongly maligned. You, Formosus, illegitimate, a criminal, a political climber who broke canon law and never should have worn the papal tiara. Your acts, your decrees, your appointments, all back under suspicion. Sergius didn't dig you up again. Perhaps he had the self-preservation instincts Stephen lacked, but he reopened the wound. Quietly, firmly, without apology. From there, your legacy became a theological ping-pong ball, batted back and forth across decades. Each new pope inherited not just the throne, but the increasingly awkward question of what to do with Formosus. Uphold him? Ignore him? Use him as an object lesson in humility? A case study in canon law? A boogeyman for over-ambitious bishops? Some popes quietly reaffirmed your legitimacy, but didn't talk about it. Others avoided the topic like it was cursed, which in fairness it kind of was. A few theologians used your case to justify reforms, others to argue for stricter limits on papal power. You were a precedent, a warning, a trivia question with teeth. Even the canon lawyers didn't agree. Some cited your case as proof that the church could self-correct. Others cited it as proof that the church should never try. Over time, the absurdity of the synod started to eclipse its original motivations. You weren't remembered for your diplomacy in Bulgaria, or your conflict with the Spolitans, or your coronation of Arnulf. You were remembered for the chair, for the ropes, for the moment your fingers hit the basilica floor. The trial became a grotesque legend, repeated with varying degrees of horror and humour. The church, which has always been fond of pageantry, suddenly found itself the star of its own unintentional satire. And the problem with satire is that it sticks. The more people told the story, the pope who put another pope on trial, the corpse that blinked, the finger that rolled away, the more impossible it became to treat it seriously. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a punchline, and in the eyes of many, that made it even more dangerous. The church could endure schism, it could endure war, but being laughed at, that was harder to spin. So, eventually, the strategy shifted again. Not condemnation, not celebration, but silence. You were not officially erased. That would be messy, but you were gradually moved to the margins. Your name became complicated, your story troubling, Your memory, an open file everyone agreed not to read too closely. History smoothed over the worst edges with the soft sandpaper of time. A few scholars kept your flame alive, but most simply filed you away under weird papal stuff and left it at that. And yet you persisted, quietly, awkwardly, uncomfortably. You became the ghost in the papal archives, a name everyone knew, but no one quite knew what to do with. Theological factions invoked you when it was useful. Debates about papal infallibility sometimes mentioned you in hushed tones. Church historians disagreed over how much you mattered, but they all agreed you were impossible to ignore. Eventually the church moved on. It had to. New popes rose and fell. New heresies emerged. New councils were convened. The Reformation hadn't even been invented yet. There were far bigger fires coming. But you, Pope Formosus, remained. Not as a saint, not as a villain, not as a martyr or a monster, just as a question. And in the Catholic Church, that may be the strangest legacy of all. If you're looking for a grand moral takeaway from all this, you'll be disappointed. There is no triumphant resolution, no divine justice handed down from the heavens, no cosmic balance restored. The Pope doesn't learn a lesson. The villains aren't marched off in chains. There is no candlelit apology, no heavenly beam of light affirming that righteousness has prevailed. What you get instead is a long, strange slide into ecclesiastical absurdity, a bureaucratic fever dream where vendettas wear vestments and personal feuds are immortalized in parchment and psalms. There's no moral arc here, just a procession of grimly fascinating details. You don't die a hero. You don't die a villain either. You die a human being who made powerful enemies in a system where forgiveness was optional and paperwork was eternal. The machinery of the church didn't pause when you died. It just turned a little more slowly, with a bit more creaking, until someone figured out how to use your corpse to settle a political score. That's the real lesson. Not that power corrupts. Everyone in Rome already knew that. But that the church, even at its most sacred, was still a very human institution, full of very human egos. Doctrine mattered, sure. Scripture mattered, occasionally. But most of what passed for holy judgment came down to timing, grudges, and whether the right person had woken up cranky that morning. Canon law was less a moral code and more a scavenger hunt for loopholes. Your downfall wasn't theological, it was tactical. You'd climbed too high, backed the wrong political faction, switched teams once too often, and made the mistake of dying while your enemies still had breath and ambition. The laws they used against you weren't new. They were ancient, contradictory, and selectively enforced. The church had long maintained that a bishop shouldn't transfer sees, but no one cared about that until you made it convenient to care. Suddenly your papacy was illegal, retroactively, magically. Because canon law, like most tools of power, could be sharpened after the fact. And when it became useful to punish you, the fact that you were dead was not a deterrent. It was an advantage. You couldn't defend yourself. You couldn't rally your allies. You couldn't remind people why they once followed you. You were an ideal defendant, silent, malleable, photogenic in a grotesque kind of way. Your body could be dressed up, sat down, and turned into a cautionary tale with no interruptions. That's the second lesson. If your enemies outlive you, they can still win. Death is not an escape. Not in Rome. Not in a church where memory is elastic, revenge is ritualized, and every document can be amended by someone with enough wax and a firm enough signature. The third lesson is equally bleak. Never cross an angry bishop. Especially not multiple bishops. Especially not bishops with time on their hands and access to clerical archives. These were not soft men in prayerful contemplation. These were administrators, politicians, sometimes warlords. They wore cassocks, but they wielded canon law like a dagger, slowly, with precision, and in public. They never forgot a slight. They collected grievances the way monks collected relics, and if they didn't get you while you were breathing, they'd make sure to get you once you stopped. The fourth lesson is the most bureaucratically horrifying. Never assume death gets you out of paperwork. It doesn't. If anything, your death created more forms, not fewer. Your posthumous trial required scribes, witnesses, clergy, guards, handlers, and a disturbingly calm man with a ceremonial knife. There were formal charges read aloud, a defence, technically, and a sentence recorded for the archives. Someone, somewhere, had to submit a requisition for a chair sturdy enough to support a rotting body. Someone had to sign off on a schedule for exhumation and robe retrieval. It's not just that you were tried after death, it's that you were processed. In the end, your downfall was filed under clerical misconduct. No lightning bolts, no divine wrath, just a chain of signatures and some unsettlingly enthusiastic compliance. It's easy to laugh at it now, the idea of a pope screaming at another pope's skeleton, the ropes, the throne, the dismembered fingers. It all sounds too bizarre to be real, a fever dream conjured up by a mad scribe and embellished over centuries. But it happened. And the laughter, however natural, shouldn't obscure the truth. This wasn't just a farce, it was a system functioning exactly as it was designed to. A system where punishment didn't require proportionality, just paperwork. And for every pope who followed you, every bishop with a political alliance, every cleric who bent the rules, your story lingered. Not as a deterrent against corruption, but as a reminder of how corruption operates. You weren't a martyr, you weren't a saint, but you were an example of what could happen when power got bored, of how easy it was to become a scapegoat when the mob was restless and the mitre was crooked. To the common folk, you became a whisper, a bedtime story for clergy, a joke told in bad Latin behind abbey doors, the pope who got tried after death, the pope who blinked during his trial, the pope who floated. No one remembered your diplomacy, no one cited your theology, but they all remembered the ropes and the river. So no, there was no grand moral, just a series of small grim truths that survive in the margins. That power is fragile, that memory is weaponized, that bureaucracy doesn't end when you do, that even silence can be used against you, and that sometimes, even when you're 6 feet under, or drifting somewhere near a sewer outlet, you're still not off the hook. Eventually, the church gave up trying to decide what to do with you, not because the questions had been resolved, or because someone finally found a theological loophole large enough to bless your legacy with certainty. No, it was far simpler than that. People got tired, exhausted really. You had become more trouble dead than you ever were alive. A fact that might have made you laugh, if laughing wasn't off the table for reasons of anatomical disqualification. They had tried everything. Trial, burial, reburial, annulment, reinstatement, finger removal, river disposal, and symbolic rehabilitation. There was nothing left to do, except stop doing. And so, at some point, probably under the vague directive of just fix it, a group of monks retrieved what remained of your body and gave you one final burial. Quietly, quickly, and by the standards of 9th century Rome, discreetly, which mostly just meant no shouting. There was no procession, no papal seal, no ring of mourners, no banners, no choir echoing through the basilica. The earth received you with no more fanfare than it might a broken bench or a bag of old vestments. The monks likely said a prayer. They were monks after all. But it was not the solemn pageantry due to a pontiff. It was the burial of a problem, not a pope. There was no plaque, no marble tomb, no Latin inscription elegantly skirting the more embarrassing parts of your biography. Just a slab, maybe, or a marker, or nothing at all. The burial equivalent of a closed file and a deep sigh. Your bones were placed into the ground in the hope that if they were buried deeply enough, no one would feel the need to dig them up again. The church had already made enough of a scene. This time, they wanted silence. As for where this grave actually is, well, that's anyone's guess. Some say you were quietly reinterred at St. Peter's Basilica, tucked away near the tombs of other popes, perhaps near the ones who hadn't made a spectacle of themselves, or who hadn't been thrown into rivers like theological driftwood. Others claim your final resting place was a much humbler church on the outskirts of Rome, chosen specifically for its obscurity, somewhere too boring to inspire future excavations, a location with no foot traffic, no curious pilgrims, and ideally no political significance whatsoever. Then there are the more sceptical accounts, the ones that suggest reburial might have been a generous term, that after being exhumed, dragged, dismembered, defrocked, dumped and refished, not all of you made it back, that some bones were lost in the Tiber, that others were scattered, mistaken, quietly disposed of, that the monks did the best they could with what they found, and what they found may not have been enough to reconstruct a full papal skeleton. You are at best partially accounted for, and yet your physical resting place matters less than what you became in death. You were never canonized, never martyred, never elevated as a spiritual hero. No gilded altars bear your likeness. No feast day was declared in your name. The church never held you up as a model of holiness. They also never fully condemned you, not permanently. You existed, then and now, in theological purgatory, a liminal figure between pope and pariah. You weren't remembered with reverence. You were remembered with hesitation. You became the ecclesiastical equivalent of a bureaucratic error that everyone keeps referencing, but no one wants to reopen. A pope, yes, but a problematic one. A man whose story was more often used as an example of what not to do by both the church and the historians who came after. A cautionary tale in silk and rot. You became a symbol, not of sainthood, not of infamy, just of consequences. The Cadaver Synod left a legacy nobody wanted to inherit. Your trial became shorthand for excess, for ego, for the dangers of letting vendettas wear vestments. And over the centuries, every time the church thought about making a dramatic correction to history, your name floated up like a bloated warning from the depths of the Tiber. Remember Formosus, they'd say, whenever someone got the idea to weaponize canon law against a corpse. That, in its own grim way, is a form of immortality. Not one you would have chosen, but real all the same. It's likely that most of the monks who buried you that final time didn't even know the full story. They knew your name maybe. They knew the whispers. They knew you had been at the centre of a scandal no one liked to talk about. And that was enough. They weren't burying a man. They were burying a mess. A controversy that wouldn't stay put. A ghost the church was desperate to lay to rest, not because it feared your spirit, but because it feared your precedent. And for the most part, it worked. You were not exhumed again. You were not relitigated by torchlight. No pope, no matter how petty, ever tried to finish what Stephen VI started. Your story was occasionally referenced, often misunderstood, and mostly avoided. You weren't cleared. You weren't honoured, but eventually you were left alone. And in Rome, that's as close to forgiveness as anyone gets. Still, your grave, wherever it is, doesn't feel like a period. It feels like an ellipsis, a trailing off at the end of a sentence no one wants to read aloud. There's no closure, no conclusion, just a sort of uneasy settling, like a book slammed shut before the final chapter could be written. The church moved on, awkwardly, quietly, with its eyes downcast. You remained buried, not quite at peace, but at least undisturbed. So maybe that's the final lesson. Not every legacy ends in clarity. Not every pope gets a polished epitaph. Some get footnotes, some get forgotten, and some, like you, get a muddy grave, a paper trail, and a reputation that won't quite stay dead. As the curtain finally falls on your bizarre posthumous journey, one truth lingers like smoke in a candlelit church. Medieval politics never die. They just mutate, change costumes, and rise again in slightly different vestments. What happened to you wasn't a fluke. It was a product of a system where theology and ambition lived in the same house, shared the same wine, and occasionally stabbed each other over dinner. The Cadaver Synod became infamous, not because it was unique in its cruelty, but because it was so shameless in its presentation. Most political purges in Rome were quieter. A poisoned goblet here, a conveniently timed illness there, an anointed rival slipping off a balcony after morning mass. But your case was loud, public, and draped in liturgical legitimacy. It forced people to look at what the church could become when its rituals were weaponized, when its laws were used not for order, but for revenge. And yet, no major reforms followed. No sweeping changes to prevent future popes from using the altar as a stage for vendettas. No outcry from Christendom about the desecration of sacred office. The church kept moving forward, step by uneasy step, as if trying to walk away from the scene without attracting too much attention. You weren't the last pope to be treated poorly by history, just the only one to have his corpse tied to a chair and put on trial in front of a crowd. Stephen VI was erased with as little ceremony as he had afforded you. His death marked a turning point. Yes, but not a transformation. The politics stayed, the factions shifted, the robes changed hands. The same arguments about who held true power, emperor or pope, Rome or the provinces, God or the man in the hat, continued to rage for centuries. And your story, strange as it was, became part of that larger narrative. You weren't remembered as a theologian. You weren't cited for your writings or praised for your insight. But you left a mark. Not the one you intended, of course. No pope sets out hoping their legacy involves being fished out of a river. But the Cadaver Synod became a symbol of excess of ego and of the church's ability to turn inward and devour its own. Every generation of clergy after you knew your name, not because they admired you, but because they feared becoming you. And then there's the irony, the deeper twist of the knife. You weren't even that unusual. Your crimes, if they could be called that, were shared by dozens of other popes and bishops. You played the game. You lost. But what truly damned you was timing. You died when your enemies were still in power and still had something to prove. You became a point they wanted to make, and they made it with ropes and robes and a rusted knife. In the end, your story is more than just macabre trivia. It's a reminder that history is written not by the victors, but by the survivors. And the survivors in 9th century Rome were rarely the ones who kept their hands clean. You, inconveniently, did not survive long enough to write your own ending. But somehow you became the ending of someone else's, Stephen VI's last act, the final note of a very bitter song. And while medieval politics may never die, neither does a good story. Yours has lasted longer than kingdoms, longer than cathedrals, longer than anyone thought it would, because once a dead pope stands trial, the church can never quite unsee it.